Hello, I'm Emily Snyder-Andrews, and I teach church music and worship leadership here at Samford University and direct the Center for Worship and the Arts. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. James Abbington. He is professor of church music at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and is also on the adjunct faculty teaching at Morehouse College. So welcome, Dr. Abbington. We're so delighted that you have joined us for this two-day residency as part of our Worship in the Black Church experience. We have already learned a lot from you and with you, and again, just welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, first, tell me a little bit about your work at Emory and at Morehouse, but I also know that you wear other hats, including at the historic Friendship Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, in your denomination, in GIA publications. So just lay out a little bit about the breadth of your work for us.
Boy, that's exhausting just to listen to, but yes, I am Associate Professor of Church Music and Worship at Candler School of Theology. Have been there now 16 years and certainly enjoy my responsibilities there, teaching intro to public worship classes, courses in music and worship in the Black church, global worship, congregational song, and other related courses to those topics. That work, I think, is best culminated in my work at Friendship Baptist Church, where I become a practitioner of that I am called upon to be a scholar and a professor of. I am Director of Music Ministries and Church Organist at the historic Friendship Baptist Church. What's significant, it is this year celebrating its 159th year, in that it is the oldest Black Baptist church in the city of Atlanta, having been established in 1862 in a boxcar by slaves, and that institution ultimately gave birth to Spelman College. Morehouse College held its classes when it moved from Augusta as Augusta Bible College, and then later became Morehouse College. So it's a very historic church, and one with a very rich history. And then outside of Friendship into the larger denominational world, I have actually been reappointed National Director of Music for the Progressive National Baptist Convention. I served back in 1990 to 94 as National Music Director under then National President Charles G. Adams when I was a student at the University of Michigan pursuing my master's and doctorate, and was also the music director and organist at Hartford Memorial Baptist Church, where he was. And at that time, I was appointed National Music Director, and I was very anxious to step down for that position. But the current president of, or should I say the late current president, who just passed away 2 years ago, called me a few years ago and asked me if I would return to that position during his administration. That was the late Dr. Timothy Stewart from Nassau, Bahamas, who was the pastor of the historic Bethel Baptist Church, which is the oldest Baptist church there in the Bahamas. And he was the first international president, and we were shocked about 2 weeks ago to hear of his passing. He had been suffering with some illnesses, but we certainly had not expected him not to make it through. But so the convention is kind of in mourning of that and preparing for a celebration later this month. But I will fulfill that term through the end of what would have been his term in August of 2022, and then be happy to turn that cap in permanently. But then the work that I have probably most enjoyed is my work with GIA Publications for well over 20 years now, in that all of my work kind of culminates in having been able to edit hymnals, compile hymnals, be a part of a lot of recording sessions of music by African American composers, African American worship resources, and that is an ongoing responsibility. I serve as executive editor of their African American church music series, and it has grown, and I've literally watched in those years GIA become the largest and certainly most prolific producer of African American worship and music resources.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about the hymnal that in 2018, right?
Yeah.
It was published and you served as editor. Tell us about that hymnal.
That was a very, very historic and an exciting project. I don't think that I've had any that was more invigorating and that was more community building. I was asked to serve on the as an associate editor of the African American Heritage Hymnal, which GIA published back in 2001. And GIA has published several hymnals since that time, but this was a very unique project in that it brought together 8 denominations that contributed and collaborated and in consultation about music from their traditions, and we certainly knew that there would not be a way of rectifying or agreeing on creeds or our scripture interpretation, but that was not our purpose. It was really to, under one cover, put music of all of these African American denominations so that those who were not able to or were not even in a position to have resources for other African American congregations to have something that could be a supplement, not the replacement of their denominational hymnals. We had to be very clear about that. But the collaborators to that project were the music directors of the African Methodist Episcopal, the AME Church, the AME Zion, or the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, Progressive Baptist, the Church of God in Christ, or many people call the Kojic Church, the Disciples of Christ, or the Christian Church, the United Church of Christ, the Congregational Church, the Black Episcopalians, and the Black Seventh-day Adventists. It was really a unique opportunity to come together and learn from each other and to learn about their traditions and to exchange music and to learn music and learn styles and traditions and so much music that some of us just never knew that was kind of housed in those denominations. So that project was released in 2018 entitled One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism, an African American ecumenical hymnal. And of course the pandemic has kind of shut down the national hymn festivals and introductions of that hymnal, but we certainly hope as we are able to move back into more in-person things, being able to do that. I think people are anxious to sing again.
That's certainly been the case on Sanford's campus. Actually, just this past weekend, we have an annual hymn sing. And so, it's been a couple of years since we were able to sing in a space like in our chapel. And it was a joyous event. But certainly that hymnal, I can't think of actually another hymnal that has that kind of ecumenical breadth. I can imagine the work behind that. As you mentioned, all the learning from one another. Those are some pretty diverse groups that you're bringing together.
It was one of the finest committees that I have worked with. From Dr. Judith McAllister, who was at that time the International Director of Music for the Church of God in Christ, and her popularity is in praise and worship. But we learned so much more about her and her deep love and rich Miss in hymnody, as well as Dr. Jason Ferdinand, who is the Director of Choral Activities and the Chair of the Music Department at Oakwood University of the Seventh-day Adventists, and Dr. Carl Molesby of the Episcopal Church, and just I mean certainly I shouldn't call names, but each one brought such uniqueness to it. Invariably, I was asked the question, did you all really get along? And I'm like, yes, we really did. We didn't always agree on what we thought should be in or out, but that's with any hymnal committee. But overall, we really enjoyed working together. We really enjoyed the collaboration, the singing through pieces, and discovering pieces, having to be honest about pieces that perhaps were not as strong as others. But it was a wonderful opportunity, and I think what it really helped us understand that in Christ we have more in common than we a lot of times think, because of all of these denominational labels that tend to keep us separated and apart.
Well, that reminds me of a comment that you made yesterday, and our event is entitled Worship in the Black Church, but as we noted yesterday, we really need to speak of worship in the Black churches.
Churches, that's right.
And that there is quite a bit of diversity in Black sacred music, of which you're an expert, but just worship more generally.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about are there any commonalities that you would say, this is how, if we are to talk about worship in the Black church or Black sacred music, these would be the key themes or practices or even beliefs that, if there are any, again, knowing that there is such diversity, that would kind of allow us to know what body of music and worship practice are we referring to if we're trying to have this focus?
Yeah, well, I think that is so important. I always laugh as I walk into the first day of class at Emory. And of course, I teach music and worship in the Black church. Now, I need to probably change the title. The dean and I have talked about that to Songs and the Sounds of Worship of Zion or something, and then just teach music and worship in the Black churches, really, because there is not a Black church. We are not a monolithic group that are defined simply by race. I mentioned in my lectures yesterday about the historic denominations that have been founded and that have been supported and that are controlled by Black people, such as the Methodist churches, the AMEs, the AME Zion, and the CMEs. And then, of course, the larger group, the Baptists, and who really organized more into conventions, a number of churches into conventions. And of course, today there are a number of churches that are dually aligned with Baptist conventions, the National Baptist Convention, USA, which is the oldest, and the National Baptist Convention of America, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, of which I am a member, which was a convention that literally gave Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement a home 60 years ago this year. There's the National Missionary Baptist Convention, and I jokingly said that the only thing about Baptists is that we continue to multiply by division. So I don't think the list can ever be completed of all the Baptist conventions and associations that are there. And then, of course, probably one of the most neglected are the holiness and Pentecostal movements, of course, the largest of which is the Church of God in Christ. And then, of course, there are holiness movements that predated in terms of their founding. The Church of God in Christ, the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World, the Church of our Lord Jesus Christ, and so on. But that Pentecostal group, certainly there are Black congregations within major white denominations like United Methodist, like the Presbyterian Church, certainly the Catholic, the Lutheran, the Episcopal Church, Seventh-day Adventist. I mentioned the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ. All of those are certainly not denominations that Black folks founded or control. There are some representation, small representation of Black leadership, but not Black control in those denominations. And in many cases, some of them have very significant congregations in terms of membership. So that's a big difference. And those denominations bring different worship styles and worship traditions. I think that the two worship styles that are most prevalent in black churches are those that have conformed from those typically white denominations, Protestant denominations, that have had very strict worship, prayer books or rituals or psalms and hymn books that pretty much dictated what worship looked like or the structure of that. Then, of course, there were the more free tradition churches that had more West African retentions, that relied more on original composition and more free order of worship or style, not to say lesser than, just different style of worship than those of the predominantly white Protestant denominations. And of course, I would say you have those that are kind of a blend or hybrid of the two. But today, I think it's interesting that when you walk into churches, you don't know what the denomination is if you observe the worship style, because there's so many different worship styles. And I do see a lot of churches that are really adhering to what kind of the mega and the tele-evangelist worship styles are. Churches that seem to feel that if we model and emulate what contemporary worship looks like, that's what will build congregations. And while that may do that for a while, the real unfortunate part is so many of our historic churches are dying because as new leadership comes in and decides they should dismantle all of the traditions of those churches, they dismantle much of the membership and people who have been there, because now in many churches there aren't even the traditional choirs. They've been replaced with praise teams. So people who volunteered and who served and who were very devoted and committed to singing in church no longer even have a place to sing, because here's a praise team of selected, anointed, in many cases paid people who come in and sing on Sunday morning. And so in many cases, those people who once served are no more, or they become simply very passive spectators in the congregation. And many of them have gone home and decided, well, we'll let them have it. So that's a real challenge in a lot of churches today, particularly as I think across the country, and I have been very, very blessed to travel this country, coast to coast, and to see and know some of the very historic churches that have made tremendous statements and have been tremendous witnesses and established institutions in communities that are literally almost standing now as just museums and mausoleums that are empty. And then a lot of new churches that have very little backgrounds, that have simply taken a different approach to worship that perhaps is more seeker sensitive, or that attempts to follow the popular culture to attract audiences and, with different types of attractions and different theological perspectives of the prosperity gospels and so many other forms of commercialism that seems to dictate or that has replaced some of the denomination and traditions. I always think of that wonderful statement by Jaroslav Pelikan that says that tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And he adds that unfortunately it is traditionalism that has given tradition a bad name. And I think there's such an urgency to resist tradition which is the living faith of the dead, our mothers and our fathers and those people who have established and whose blood shed had made it possible for us to be in church. We have decided to eliminate that for something because unfortunately many churches have been guilty of that traditionalism. You know, it's the dead faith of those who live, or those now who feel like we're going to spice it up, or we're going to punch it up, or we're going to make it more appealing, or we're going to market it, and or we're going to be more consumer driven in our approach to worship. That we no longer seem to have a real focus or tradition. In fact, I sometimes have to ask how Christian is our worship, and that Christ tends to mess it up, because if we are more Christocentric in our worship, we cannot be as narcissistic and as ego-driven as we are.
Yeah. It's a convicting thought and question. I mean, that one that is fairly universal, I think, at least in the church in the United States.
In the United States.
I mean, something that we really need to be wrestling with, this question about how much is Christ-centered,
how much Christocentric
in our worship. I wonder too, and I'm hearing again, you know, I have to think about it also in my own context, which is the only context really that I truly know. As you're sharing, and there's so many generational questions that are being raised with what you're mentioning, because the fact is some of those, when tradition is kind of left or even neglected or just eschewed intentionally, it does happen that, you know, some young people, when they're not raised in that context, perhaps that leaving of tradition is not so intentional as much as it is ignorance.
Absolutely, that's right.
They just don't know it. And that certainly is the case even across white churches and white traditions and denominations as well. What are the challenges of intergenerational worship today in your own context and experiences? I know the Center for Worship in the Arts, we really have that at the center of our mission, intergenerational worship, and we've come across and confronted some very concrete and real cultural challenges where it's hard to foster an imagination, an ecclesial imagination where intergenerational worship can be valued and kind of lay a path where it can be practiced even. So what are your experiences
I
here?
would say very much the same. I don't think there are any differences. Certainly in my position as a professor in a seminary, I look at what we say and how we love to articulate so rhetorically the phrases about being relevant to the future leaders in the church, although our curriculums don't really reflect it. And that's one of the challenges that I think is also beginning to create some real questions about the future of theological education, because people are questioning whether or not the seminaries are really preparing them for the church today. I would think or hope that seminaries would begin to do as the automakers used to do in Detroit and have a recall of some of those early MDivs and alum, and look at what they've learned and where we are now and how we can retool and we can realign some of that faulty error in our designs, in our curriculums, because I don't think that it is intentional that people want to become outdated and irrelevant, but it happens. And I also think that one of the real challenges in leadership in so many of the churches is that we don't really train our people how to first understand who they are serving in the congregations, and to really understand the demographics of that local congregation, not this congregation that you imagine or that you see on TV or that you hear about in another city or that you have witnessed in your growing up, but what about these young people that, as you said, and that's a great point, they have not been exposed to this. They don't understand tradition. They're seeking. They're interested, but Many times the way we're packaging it, is completely unattractive and just not palatable, for them. And I am afraid that I place a lot of the blame on the leadership of the church, the way that they're playing. Many students go through school, but school never goes through them. They finish degrees, and they're very proud to talk about, I have a double master's, I have a D-Min and a PhD. But unfortunately, there's no evidence of it in their productivity, their work, or anything that anyone would find significant other than they finished the degree, but obviously the degree didn't do much to finish them to serve the present age. And I'm concerned about young people who don't even think of the church. They pretty much can pull out their iPhones. There was a time where, we need to do something about the music. The music will attract young people. No, young people have everything they need on their iPhone. And they can have as much church and really surf for some of the best preaching or preaching that appeals to them on their phone. So they need not try to run to a building to find what they can get on their phone. And remain in their own communities and in their own environments. But I do think that it is incumbent upon the church to take some very serious assessments of what we've lost, what we could be gaining. But it takes leadership that is passionate, that I think that is really truly called of God, that is committed, that's creative, that's prepared and sensitive to the times. I've just really been very disheartened, by people who have visions but seemingly have no provisions to support their visions in churches. They walk in and they have, like politicians, they have good lines, they have good things that they, we're going to revive the church from cradle to college. And there are no babies, and all we can see is folk running to college and away from the church. But we want to reach another generation, but we're not speaking their language. It's like going to Italy and speaking Russian and wondering why people don't understand you, or they turn from you. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be retooled. With regard to music, musicians are differently prepared. There are a lot of very gifted and talented musicians who have innate ear skills. If they hear it, they can play it, or they can hear music and create it. We know these students that exist, and I'm afraid that they probably represent the larger number of musicians serving in churches today. And then there are those who pretty much have grown up through the formal training of music where, as it is often said, they become a slave to the page. If they don't see the notes, they can't play it. I mean, it's like their hands are tied, so their improvisatory skills are limited. But ideally, to serve the church today, you need both. It's not an either or, but certainly a both and. There are churches where maybe one of the other skills might serve them, but that's pretty restrictive. So musicians are not certainly being trained that way in colleges, conservatories, music schools. That's just not what happens. You say you want to learn to improvise, go take jazz or something. We assume that these are the catch-alls, but we don't know the tradition. So when you start talking about black worship traditions, what are they? What are some of the common characteristics? Well, there's a whole genre of music by black composers, by Thomas Dorsey, by Kenneth Morris, by Doris Akers, by Margaret Durow, some of the early pieces of Lucy Campbell that have been the traditions of the church and seem to, I'm thinking of Albert Goodson's We've Come This Far by Faith, a song that young people don't like or dislike. They haven't been exposed to it or heard it. Its text and its music is one that says, we've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord, trusting in His holy word. He never failed me yet. I can't tell, so this is the kind of hope and affirmation. But if they don't hear this is not something that they hear, they don't know. That does not mean that their song is not important, because it is. As I think that was so movingly illustrated last night in the work that Urban Doxology is doing with Reverend David Bailey. As I said on that panel, I should have probably had an opportunity to watch that twice before I got on stage with the panel with Reverend Bailey there to talk about it, because I just looked at those young people and the beautiful diversity that was there, and just what they were wrestling with and all the things that they come with, and how important that voice is, but how voiceless it is in so many of our churches. And that concerns me. I find myself talking about one of my colleagues' books quite a bit, that I think is so instructive to the discussion of black church, black music and worship. And that's Dr. Walter Fluker, who is the author of a book, The Ground Has Shifted, The Future of the Black Church in Post-Racial America. And I like what Dr. Fluker is saying in that book, because I think it says that if we're really serious about intergenerational or multi-generations in church, we've got to look at what's happened. The ground has shifted. Things are different. And we may not want to admit it, but the young people have already left the building. They're not leaving. They're gone. They're not there. This is something that, we need more young people in the church. Well, they're gone. And they're not going to come back just because we want them to come and sit and conform to the things that we want, or expect them to come knowing all of the things that we have done in the traditions that the church has celebrated. But we've got to be willing to embrace them. Fluker says that we must leave the church if we're serious about our young people, and go to find out where our young people are and what has caught their attention, where their concerns, where their passions, where their heart is, where their focus is now centered with Christ, as a part of that, but just not in this room building that we worship as the church. But they're being the church in other places. But we're going to have to leave that comfortable building, find out where these people are, and learn to congregate with them, and see how that the church can become an extension, as opposed to the assembly place. We're going to have to decide maybe how we assemble, how we congregate, that won't be in the church, and that's going to be very, very uncomfortable for people who have not had to do that. But those are the challenges that are in front of us.
I wonder if to think about that context and kind of, again, take it back to training and forming future worshipers, but future church musicians, worship leaders. We both serve in the academy, but it seems to me that if we're going to retool, realign, rethink, the academy needs to do that work, and the church does as well. So what are the roles and ways that you, and again, there's no silver bullet. We can't forecast the future, but what would you see would be some helpful ways for the church and the academy to work together in realigning and retooling its formation for its leaders?
We kind of hinted to that yesterday in a conversation, and I think that it's appropriate that we revisit that, as this particular wonderful occasion comes to an end for this year, or for this period that you have. But I would love to see, as we witnessed just a little bit at the dinner last night, more conversations and coming together of pastors and musicians, church leadership. I was so impressed with the pastor and the music director. The young man was a graduate of Stanford, he's I think a church music major. He was a master's student, but he is music director at one of the churches here, and his pastor was sitting there with him last night. And and then to hear them kind of feed off of each other, he's talking about the work that he did, and they talked about the work of each other, but they were there looking at and listening to this conversation about reconciliation, and they were talking about the wonderful things that they have done, but how they know that there needs to be something else, there needs to be more. And as I looked around the room, I was delighted to see other local pastors that were present, but I'm like, wonder where their musicians are. Wonder where, what this room would look like if there were a table of pastors and music directors from these various traditions discussing these common issues, looking at the problems, finding those folks that have managed to find some very effective ways to deal with this, and others who are terrified, and others who don't even realize they have a problem, who are content that the youth department is ages 60 to 72. And but I thought that was a wonderful gathering. It was a wonderful start. But where that conversation may be, it may be that the academy is too intimidating. So there may have to be a common ground away from the church, away from the academy, that can be organized. Sanford may have to be the one to ring the, or to make the call for this, for the coming together of these. But I think it's incumbent that people address the problem. Realize that this is an issue, that we do need this retooling, we need this realigning. What a wonderful situation to have a music director who's been trained and who's been a part of and exposed to the seminary as well as musical training, a pastor certainly who is theologically prepared, but who is also very community and passionate about the gospel, the work of his people, the work of the community. And then the others that were there who are as well, but may not have that kind of collaboration. And that, I think, is something that we can foster. And how there was a young man who was there that I hope to personally meet and to mentor and encourage, who I understand is extremely talented. And he's at a church, but I just hope that he's not there as a talented person who becomes basically a source of religious entertainment as opposed to a worship leader. I quoted A.W. Tozier at least twice during my stay here, and that is congregations, churches that have not been taught to worship must be entertained. And those of us who lead worship must provide that entertainment. And God forbid that we're guilty of that. But I think too often we find churches that are looking for a hot musician or a popular musician or the recording artist, or we're looking for somebody that will draw the people, a kind of a gospel rock star, if you will. The congregation is looking for a celebrity pastor, and we think that this is what it takes to grow the church. Well, there's a difference between growing and swelling. And there may be churches that are swelling, but they're not growing. And there are some churches that are smaller in numbers, but their substance and the quality of what they're doing is outstanding. I have discovered that particularly in my work on the grants board at Calvin University. There are churches who are doing just incredible things. They're not mega church, but they certainly have mega ambitions and mega and vital worship going on in their congregations. And I think that kind of coming together and that kind of reasoning and looking at things and saying, I love the discussion. It's one thing to recognize, to reconcile, but the first thing that you've got to recognize that there has been something has gone wrong. We've got to, it's one thing to come back for a realignment or a redesign, but you've got to figure out what went wrong on the car. And I think that in some cases, there's some folk that don't realize that there's a problem. They just know that people aren't there anymore, and they assume everybody's dying. No, they're not all dying. No, that's not true. That's not true. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you kind of mentioned some of the trends. I mean, that we're all, looking for maybe a recording artist, or, we all have felt the impact of the church growth movement and the seeker service movement. But can you speak or reflect more on those hidden gems, perhaps, like the practices that might not be, that we are all aware of per se, or that are practiced at the mega churches or the largest churches, but some of what you would say, but these are the practices that I've noticed in your work really around the country that we really should be paying attention to now.
There are, as I said, there are churches with less than 300, less than 250, where pastors are really committed to preaching and teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. They are committed to their people, to their communities, and to vibrant, vital, meaningful, relevant, biblically based, theologically sound worship. And they work well with their musicians to make these things happen on a local basis. I'm thinking of a church in Little Rock, Arkansas. I won't call names, but certainly not a mega church, but the practices weekly that happen, first of all, the communication and the respect and sharing between that pastor and that musician, that they see themselves as a team and not rivals. Eileen Guther's book is the best for that. Teams, not a rival, or rivals. But I see them, I know how they've worked together so that the congregation that comes on Sunday morning anticipates an encounter with God, not a weekly performance, but a real encounter with God, and the quality of what happens there is just always breathtaking. I'm thinking of a church in Chicago, by no means a large church, although Chicago is a large city. I think it's a Lutheran church. I don't think they have 300 members. I'm not sure where, but every Sunday it's thoughtful. It's relevant to what has happened in that city, in their community, and through the gospel they reach their people through the various gifts and talents of that congregation, through visual, through performing arts, through the spoken words, through just being collaborative, bringing generations into the discussions of and to the planning of worship. In fact, I think if it happened in a mega church, it wouldn't be as effective. So, and there are just so many unsung situations like that are going on. And it may be that that's the kind of convocation that we need to have, of locating and finding those real vital situations where congregations are being fed and that are really having an encounter with Christ in worship. That would be meaningful to the church. And trust me, if that happens, the church will legitimately grow. It will attract other people. But it is not about quantity. It's about the quality of the people that come. I used to think many times about, I sure hope a lot of people show, that we assume that because 100, 150, 70 people come to a lecture or something, whoa, we had a big crowd. I remember once a friend was playing an organ recital, and he invited a lot of his church folk to come, and they packed into the recital hall, and the faculty were very impressed to see all of these people coming for this recital, and he began playing, and probably about 2/3 of them were off to sleep. In fact, one couple just kind of snored. They had to keep kind of waking them up, and then they'd wake up to applaud at the end. But they were there, just proud of their music director, but they had no real understanding of it other than we were here to support our music director. but your music put me to sleep.
Yeah.
So I would rather have that 35, 40, 50 people that come that are really engaged and that really have an appreciation for what you've done and how you've done it and what that music means. And I think that takes a little growing and wisdom, because we tend to weigh things or value things in this country by quantity. How many. The British on the other side weigh things by pounds. How many pounds? What is the weight of it? And so when you look at some congregations, they're very heavy, but there may not be the quantity there that one would expect.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up this conversation, I wonder, you're an educator, you teach a variety of ages, but especially young people. Would you offer a message of hope for especially young people who are thinking about a future in church leadership, who might be discerning a call to service in the church? There's a lot of challenges that the church and its leaders face today, as you know. So, if you're feeling a call to that world, what's your message of hope for them today?
Well, I think one of the things that I have said, and I continue to say to a lot of them, is that you really have to have some tough skin. You have to, if it's not a work for the lighthearted, if you think everybody's going to like you, if you think everybody's going to be enthusiastic, that you got tricked. But if you've been called to it and God has truly called you for it, He will keep you. His call will keep you as well. But like anything, you have to beware of where you go and what you're attracted to. I know a lot of young people who get excited about their call because they see a particular personality or a celebrity that they want to be like, so they're attracted. I want to be like, or I want to be at so and so and so and so, as opposed to their call. I think one of the things that I really strongly encourage them to do is to equip yourself with all of the skills and the knowledge and the understanding. Just be a sponge for all the things that you need to equip and make you a stronger and a better person, a musician and a leader. Before you become a worship leader, first be a model worshiper. Don't be the person that's up conducting if you can't follow. And I think that young people then have to be nourished to find places that really meet their call. I think sometimes we're not honest about where we send young people. I know occasionally I will get calls and I will say, that's just not the place. It's kind of like your mother and my mother. I'm sure when we were growing up, there were just some places they wouldn't let us go play. There were some houses that they wouldn't let us go, and we didn't understand. Why can't I go? But the parents knew that was not necessarily the best place for their daughter to be or their son to go. And I think we have to be honest about that, because they look to us for those kinds of things. But I do think that ultimately God has a way, I have seen it so many times, of connecting that place, that person with with the divine destination for them. God is not going to call them without a place to go. That's for sure. That's what we have to know. But finding that path is important. But in the meantime, until you find that path, take advantage of as many things. I know one of my early realizations about this kind of work was not that colleges and universities are going to do it all, because in many cases they're not equipped to do it. But I do think that there's something to be said for the whole intern experience. When you think about so many of the great Western European composers, it was not the conservatories, it was not the institutions that they attended that made them what they were. It was by their collaborations with their apprenticeships, their copying the works of other composers, their modeling, for them. Schubert's obsession with Beethoven, Bach's traveling to see Buxtehude. These kinds of things play. those are the kinds of things that I think that are important, and making sure that these young people are nourished in environments that prepare them for the next place, because it can be very disheartening, and you don't want to see them discouraged, or because they hit their first bump in the road, you know, they're completely devastated and feel that this was not their call. But to have people that are in a position to be good supervisors, good nourishing and constant abiding companions to them through their struggles, and through their development and through their growth, because I can think of the countless number of people in my life who were there for me. I just didn't grow up knowing and doing. There were people, very strategic people, that God placed in my life for those seasons, for those reasons, and in many cases, some for a lifetime. And I know that as God did that for me, He will do the same for them. And it is incumbent upon those of us who have now had these experiences and are beginning the fourth quarters of our professional life to look back at these folks who are just beginning the game, so that hopefully we can help them not make the mistakes that we made along the way.
That's a good word.
Yeah.
Well, on behalf of the Center for Worship in the Arts, Dr. Abington, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
It has been a delight. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.